Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hi everyone, welcome back to our series, Rendezvous with Death, where we look at the Americans who joined the World War I effort with the French Foreign Legion before America formally enters the war. In the last episode, we looked at the Battle of Verdun, perhaps the most grisly combat in all of World War I. In this episode, we're going to see as Americans take to the air and the American squadron forms in earnest. As David King, Bob Scanlon, Ferdinand Capdeville, William Duggan, and the other Americans in the 170th fought for their lives on the ground at Verdun, a desperate struggle was taking place in the skies above them. The French High Command was determined to overturn the overwhelming air superiority enjoyed by the Germans at the onset of the battle. And air superiority was a concept that military strategists were really having to deal with for the first time in warfare. The orders went out to clear the skies of Germans, and the small experimental squadron of American pilots, led by Frenchmen Georges Thénault and Alfred Delage de Meaux, would take part in the struggle. Flying a biplane known as the Bébé for its diminutive size, the American unit became something of a cross between a legitimate pursuit squadron and a flying publicity stunt. The members of the squadron and 124 of the Service Aéronautique first assembled in April 1916 at an aerodrome outside of Luxeuil-les-Bains. The village was located west of the Vosges and south of Verdun in a quiet sector far removed from the front lines. Officially, they were assigned to this locale as fighter escorts for a nearby bomber base, but that was more on paper than reality. It was believed that this interlude would allow the squadron to learn how to function as a unit and thus not embarrass themselves or their supporters once they entered combat over Verdun. There was simply too much riding on the success or failure of this endeavor to leave it to chance. The original 7 pilots included 4 of the volunteers of 1914, Kiffin Rockwell, Ivy Leaguers William Thaw and Victor Chapman, and mystery man Bert Hall. They were joined by Norman Prince, the Massachusetts North Shore country squire, fellow Blue Blood Elliot Cowden, and James McConnell, who had served with Dr. Edmund Gross's ambulance field service prior to enlisting in the Service Aéronautique and earning his pilot's wings. There were only 5 planes for the 9 members of the squadron, the brand spanking new Newport 11s, fresh from the factory. All the pilots had served with French squadrons in various sectors in 1915 and early 1916, primarily piloting slower-moving aircraft involved in observing enemy preparations or bombing enemy positions. Now they would have the chance to fly the single-seater fighters as pursuit squadron members. It was a difficult and dangerous job. It was also a glamorous one. With the possible exception of William Thaw, the Americans were all affected by this. How couldn't they be? By 1916, the exploits of pilots such as the German Oswald Bulck and the Frenchman Charles Nungesser and Georges Gunmeyer had made them matinee idols. The press loved them, and the militaries were happy to create heroes for the public to adulate. In a war that had become incomprehensible to most civilians, these dashing men, dueling high above France, reminded them of the medieval knights that they had read about as children. The Americans embraced the part. Luxeuil-les-Bains had an atmosphere of Eden-like unreality. The surrounding countryside on the western slope of the Vosges was some of the prettiest in France. Victor Chapman was already familiar with the region after having hiked a number of peaks there in the summer of 1915. The town itself was the site of a spa, its population a little less than 3,000 inhabitants in 1916, most of whom were women. The Nault's young eagles lived well. The historian Herbert Molloy Mason Jr. has described their time as an idyll. The pilots moved into a small stone villa adjoining the Roman baths. Each had a private room with a feather bed and a window overlooking the hills beyond. 5 minutes' walk down the shaded cobblestone streets brought them to the dining room of the Hôtel Palme d'Or. For all of its great quantity and indisputable quality, a meal at the Palme d'Or never cost more than 4 francs, less than $1 American. The squadron's first flight was a sortie over the German lines near Mulhouse on the Swiss border on May 13, 1916. It was a beautiful spring day. The Nieuports, painted in a camouflage design of green and brown, or an odd cream color with the distinctive French red, white, and blue concentric circles on their wings, crow-hopped over the airfield, then growled into the skies. The Bébé was France's answer to the Fokker scourge that had menaced France since mid-1915. The plane's powerful rotary engine spun with its propeller, creating a highly responsive machine, particularly when making tight turns to the right. This enhanced maneuverability came with a price, however. When flying the Bebe, one needed to pay constant attention to it. A moment's lapse in attention could lead to dangerous consequences. Thus, the plane was both a joy and at the same time extremely stressful to fly. Fitted midway atop the top wing was a Lewis machine gun that fired 47 rounds of bullets. With the pilot's finger pressing the trigger continuously, this meant approximately a 5-second burst of fire. After that, the French pilot would have to stand up, remove the empty can, and replace it, all the while minding the plane's controls, sometimes with his knees. For comparison's sake, German planes, with their synchronized guns, could fire 1,000 rounds before having to reload. This was a distinct disadvantage, yet the Bebe was so superior in both speed and maneuverability that the patient and skillful pilot could all but eliminate the Germans' edge. Denault had selected Thaw, Rockwell, Chapman, and McConnell to join him in the squadron's inaugural patrol. The plan was to fly in a V-shaped formation, with the more experienced Denault and Thaw flying behind and slightly above their fellow pilots. Rockwell would take the lead at the point of the V. Once airborne, they circled above the meadow and got into formation, heading east. All went smoothly until at 7,000 feet they encountered clouds and lost James McConnell, who headed off course toward the snow-topped Alps to the south. Fortunately, Denault spotted him and dove to shepherd him back to the flock. Being so high above the earth in these rickety planes, which were little more than string and canvas and a powerful engine, was exhilarating. Never mind the deafening noise of the engine and the high-pitched whine of the bracing wires, the overpowering smell of castor oil, much like French fries, and castor oil is a powerful laxative, so breathing its fumes in the sky might lead to a decidedly unromantic result for the pilot, and the bone-numbing cold as they climbed higher was exhilarating. There's something elemental about flying an open cockpit aircraft, or at least the pilots described it like that spoke to their inner Icarus and all human beings. The closed cockpits and pressurized cabins of later decades provide more comfort for pilots and passengers, but something of the thrill has been lost for pilots who flew in both types of planes, as they report. For the 5 men heading east that morning towards the Rhine, shining silver in the distance, the thrill was all there was. At 13,000 feet, the 5 planes crossed no man's land over Mulhouse and encountered German anti-aircraft fire from the Archies, guns that seldom proved lethal, but shells bursting in the air could play havoc with the pilot's nerves as their concussions jostled the fragile aircraft. Kiffen Rockwell, true to form, chose to make a game of piloting his plane through the puffs of black smoke created by the bursting shells. Chapman and McConnell joined him, shredding the smoke in swirling tendrils with their propellers. Then Rockwell dove gracefully towards the German base at Hapsheim, casting his plane around in whirling acrobatics, challenging the Germans. But no Germans came, and low on fuel, the Nieuports turned for home. And so the Escadrille Américaine passed its first test with flying colors. No combat, but no serious mishaps either. No one had frayed nerves. The same day, Norman Prince and Elliot Cowden returned from Paris with a report and a film crew to document their activities for audiences back home. The French bomber crews and their Morris Farmans and the Americans and their Nieuports put on an impromptu aerial display for the cameras. Rockwell and Burt Hall groused afterwards that they had some royalties coming for risking their necks in maneuvers so close to the ground. The anecdote is telling because there was an element of show business about what they were doing, even as deadly earnest as they were. This romantic venture had the potential to stir hearts on the other side of the Atlantic, though perhaps not President Woodrow Wilson's, and generate more sympathy for the fight France was waging. It would have been impossible for camera crews to accurately document what had occurred at Navarin Farm or at the Bois de Calette, for instance, but this was much easier. That was the beauty of it from a public relations standpoint. Even the Germans were aware of Denault's young eagles. They were keen to test them, and best them, to send a message of their own. To no one's surprise, it was Kiffen Rockwell who drew first blood in combat against the Germans. The aerodrome at Luxeuil-les-Bains had been bombed by the Germans soon after the squadron's first sortie. His fighting blood up, Kiffen climbed into his Nieuport and headed east, alone, toward the German lines, and found nothing. The French Air Force emphasized individual initiative, and thus pilots such as Kiffen Rockwell were often encouraged by their commanders to patrol on their own, in between their established schedules of regular patrols if they wished to do so. Engine trouble forced him homeward. Then, inside the French lines, he saw it. About 2,000 feet below him, an LVG biplane with the distinctive black crosses painted on its wings. He dove, forgetting his engine trouble, and the bébé responded. Closing with his intended victim, Rockwell saw a stream of lead spouting at him from the gunner located in the rear of the reconnaissance aircraft. Rockwell recounted what happened next in an excited letter written to his brother Paul that very day. My machine was hit, but I didn't pay attention to that and kept going straight for him, until I got within 25 or 30 meters of him. Then, just as I was afraid of running into him, I fired 4 or 5 shots and swerved my machine to the right to keep from running into him. As I did that, I saw the mid-trawler fall back dead on the pilot, the mitrailleuse falling from its position and point straight up in the air. The pilot fell to one side of the machine as if he were done for also.